Imagine you are standing on a narrow strip of coastline. Behind you, a small Greek city. Before you, the sea. And on that sea, a fleet so vast, so impossibly enormous, that it darkens the horizon like a storm. 100,000 men. Some say 200,000. Some say more. They have come from the edges of the known world, from Persia, from Egypt, from Babylon, from the distant steppes of Central Asia. They serve one man, one king, a god-king who has declared that the earth and water of Greece belong to him, and that the free peoples of this peninsula will kneel or they will burn. You are a Greek soldier. You are a farmer, a potter, a fisherman, a father. You have perhaps 48 hours to live. And yet you do not run. This is the story of the Greco-Persian Wars, a conflict that lasted half a century, consumed hundreds of thousands of lives, and decided the fate of an idea so fragile, so young, so radical, that most of the ancient world had never encountered it. That idea was this: that ordinary people could govern themselves, that law could be mightier than any king, that freedom was worth dying for. What happened on the plains of Marathon, in the mountain pass at Thermopylae, and on the waters of Salamis did not just shape the ancient world. It shaped every world that came after. Stay with us, because this story is one you need to hear. Civilizations crashed into each other with such catastrophic force you have to go back. Back before the battles, before the blood, before the burning of cities. You have to understand what Persia was, and what Greece was, and why those two things could never peacefully coexist. By the late 6th century BC, the Persian Empire was the largest empire the world had ever seen. Under Cyrus the Great, and then Cambyses, and then the extraordinary Darius I, Persia had swallowed nations whole. Lydia fell. Babylon fell. Egypt fell. The Persian Empire stretched from the Indus River in the east to the shores of the Aegean Sea in the west. A dominion of 46 nations, speaking dozens of languages, encompassing millions upon millions of souls. And at the center of this vast machine of empire sat the King of Kings, commanding absolute obedience, dispensing life and death with a word. Darius I was not a cruel man by the standards of his age. He was, in many ways, an enlightened administrator, building roads, standardizing currency, allowing conquered peoples to maintain their own customs and religions, so long as they paid their taxes and sent their sons to his wars. He was a pragmatist, a builder, a man who understood that an empire held together by terror alone will eventually consume itself. But Darius was also a man of imperial ambition, and to his west, irritatingly, stubbornly, lay a collection of small, fractious, perpetually quarreling city-states that called themselves Greek. These Greeks were, by Persian standards, barely civilized. Their cities were tiny. Their armies were small. They had no centralized government, no single king, no unified command. They argued constantly, with each other, with their own citizens, with anyone who would listen. They were, in the eyes of the Persian court, an afterthought. But they were also free. And freedom, it turns out, is a dangerous thing to leave alive near the borders of an empire. The spark that ignited the war did not come from mainland Greece at all. It came from the Greek cities of Ionia, the western coast of what is today Turkey, cities like Miletus, Ephesus, and Halicarnassus, which had fallen under Persian control a generation earlier. The Ionians were Greek by culture, language, and blood, but they lived under Persian governance, administered by local tyrants installed and supported by Darius. In 499 BC, the Ionians revolted. The Ionian Revolt, as history would call it, was ignited by a man named Aristagoras of Miletus, a politician of flexible morals and considerable ambition who, having made a spectacular mess of a Persian military campaign, decided his best chance of survival was to set the entire region on fire. Aristagoras traveled to mainland Greece seeking support. He went first to Sparta, the most powerful military state in Greece, and made his case before the Spartan king, Cleomenes. The Spartans characteristically declined. They were a land power. They had no interest in overseas adventures. They sent him away. Then Aristagoras went to Athens. And Athens, newly democratic, fired with revolutionary energy, bristling with civic pride, said yes. They sent 20 ships. It was, as the historian Herodotus would later write, the beginning of evils for both Greeks and barbarians. 20 ships, 20 ships that would eventually set the entire Mediterranean world ablaze. The Ionians and their Athenian allies marched inland and burned Sardis, the great Persian administrative capital of the region. The burning of Sardis was a humiliation that Darius would not forget. According to legend, when Darius heard that Athens had been involved in the attack, he called for a servant and commanded that every day, 3 times at dinner, the servant would say to him, "Master, remember the Athenians. Remember the Athenians." Those words would echo across the next 2 decades of history. The Ionian revolt ultimately failed. The Persian navy crushed the Ionian fleet at the Battle of Lade in 494 BC. Miletus, the greatest Greek city in Asia, was sacked and burned. Its people were enslaved or scattered. The revolt was over. But Darius had not forgotten. He had barely begun. In 492 BC, Darius launched the first Persian invasion of mainland Greece. His son-in-law Mardonius led a powerful force westward, crossing the Hellespont, marching through Thrace, advancing toward Greece with the full weight of Persian imperial power behind him. But nature intervened. A violent storm off the coast of Mount Athos destroyed much of the Persian fleet. 300 ships, it was said, and 20,000 men swallowed by the Aegean. Mardonius retreated. The invasion was postponed, not abandoned. Darius spent the next 2 years preparing a second attempt. This time he would go by sea, a direct amphibious assault on the Greek mainland. He sent heralds ahead, as was the Persian custom, demanding earth and water from the Greek cities. Earth and water, symbolic tokens of submission. And many cities gave them. Aegina gave them. Thebes gave them. Many of the smaller states, calculating the odds and finding them terrifying, capitulated without a fight. But not all. When the Persian heralds arrived in Athens, the Athenians threw them into a pit. When they arrived in Sparta, the Spartans threw them into a well and told them to find their earth and water there. These were acts of extraordinary defiance and of extraordinary danger. To kill the heralds of a king was an act of war so flagrant, so unambiguous, that there could be no diplomatic retreat. Athens and Sparta had committed themselves utterly to resistance. The summer of 490 BC, a Persian fleet of perhaps 600 ships, carrying somewhere between 20 and 40,000 soldiers, under the command of Datis and Artaphernes, crossed the Aegean and landed on the plain of Marathon, about 25 miles northeast of Athens. The choice of landing site was deliberate. Marathon's wide, flat plain was ideal for Persian cavalry, the arm of their military that had broken armies from Egypt to India. The Persians expected to destroy the Athenian army in the open field, then march on Athens before the city could recover. The Athenians had perhaps 10,000 soldiers. Hoplites, heavy infantry, armored in bronze, carrying long spears and large round shields, trained to fight in the close-ordered formation called the phalanx. They also had perhaps 1,000 allied soldiers from the small city of Plataea, whose loyalty to Athens was absolute and whose courage would prove equal to the moment. They sent a runner, the famous Phidippides, to Sparta, begging for help. The Spartans said they would come, but not yet. They were observing a religious festival and could not march until the moon was full. Athens would have to face Persia largely alone. The Athenian generals debated furiously. Several advocated retreat, fall back to Athens, defend the walls, wait for Sparta. But one man changed the debate. His name was Miltiades of Athens, and he had actually lived among the Persians. He had served as a client ruler in the Chersonese, on the Persian side of the Hellespont. He knew how they fought. He knew their cavalry needed space to operate. He knew the terrain of Marathon. And he knew that if the Athenians sat still, the Persians would dictate the terms of every engagement. Athens had to attack. Athens had to attack now. The vote among the 10 generals was tied. The decision fell to the war archon, a man named Callimachus. Miltiades argued his case with everything he had. He spoke of freedom. He spoke of slavery. He spoke of what Athens would become if it surrendered, and what it could become if it won. Callimachus voted with Miltiades. The Athenians would fight. On a morning in September 490 BC, the Athenians drew up their battle line across the plain of Marathon. Miltiades made a decision of breathtaking tactical daring. He thinned his center dangerously, almost recklessly thin, and strengthened both wings. Then he did something that the Persians had never seen a Greek army do. He ordered the advance at the double, his men running the last several hundred yards of open ground toward the Persian line, minimizing the time they would spend in the killing zone of Persian archers. The Persians were stunned. Running? Heavily armored soldiers running at them? The Persian archers loosed their arrows in volley after volley. But the Greeks came on, shields up, spears leveled, and then they crashed into the Persian line like a wave of bronze and iron. In the center, the thinned Greek line was pushed back. The Persians, their best troops were there, the immortals, the elite guard of the empire, pressed forward, sensing victory. But on the wings, the strengthened Greek flanks tore through the lighter Persian infantry, then wheeled inward, enveloping the Persian center from both sides simultaneously. It was a pincer movement of perfect, devastating precision. The Persian center collapsed. The rout became a massacre. The Persians ran for their ships, pursued by the howling, triumphant Athenians all the way to the waterline. When it was over, 6,400 Persians lay dead on the plain of Marathon. The Athenians lost 192 men, every one of them buried on the battlefield in a mound that still stands today, called the Soros, the heap. 192 men. It seems almost impossible. And yet the numbers are recorded, cross-referenced, and accepted by scholars as broadly accurate. A runner was sent back to Athens with the news. He ran 25 miles, burst into the assembly, cried, "We have won," and dropped dead, or so the legend says. The truth, characteristically, is more complicated, but the legend is one of the most enduring in all of human history, because it captures something true about that moment, something that transcended military calculation. Marathon was not just a victory, it was proof that free men, fighting for their own soil, their own families, their own idea of civilization, could defeat the greatest empire on earth. If you are finding this story as gripping as we do, take a moment right now, pause, hit that subscribe button, and join us on this journey through history. We have so much more to tell you. Darius raged. He began preparing a third and far larger invasion, one that would leave no room for the tactical brilliance of a single general, one that would simply overwhelm Greece with numbers so vast that resistance would become mathematically impossible. But before the preparations were complete, Darius the Great died, in 486 BC. He was perhaps 60 years old. He had built an empire that spanned 3 continents. He had humiliated Scythia and conquered Egypt and reorganized the known world. But he had not conquered Greece. That task, that wound, that festering obsession, passed to his son. His son's name was Xerxes. Xerxes was not Darius. Where Darius had been pragmatic and calculating, Xerxes was proud, imperial pride of a particular and dangerous kind, the pride of a man who genuinely believed himself to be divine. He was physically imposing. Ancient sources describe him as extraordinarily tall and handsome, a king who looked like a king. He was not stupid, but he was susceptible to flattery, prone to grandiose gestures, and possessed of a temper that could turn lethal without warning. The story of Xerxes bridging the Hellespont is one of the most extraordinary in ancient history. To move his army, the largest assembled in the ancient world, perhaps 250,000 soldiers by the most credible modern estimates, though ancient sources claim millions, from Asia into Europe, Xerxes ordered his engineers to build 2 bridges of boats across the Hellespont Strait. The engineers worked for months. Then a storm came and destroyed both bridges. Xerxes, in his rage, ordered the Hellespont itself to be punished. His men waded into the sea and gave it 300 lashes with whips. They threw chains into the water, symbols of the sea's subjugation. Then he had his engineers build new bridges, and this time they held. Watching Xerxes' army cross those bridges, Herodotus tells us, took 7 days and 7 nights without pause. 7 days, 7 nights. A river of humanity flowing from one continent to another. Soldiers from 46 nations, cavalry and infantry and engineers and supply trains and camp followers, accompanied by a fleet of perhaps 1,200 warships hugging the coastline. The earth shook under their feet. The streams of Thrace ran dry where the army drank. It is possible to overstate these numbers. Modern historians debate them endlessly. But even at the most conservative estimates, Xerxes brought an army that dwarfed anything Greece had ever faced, or could ever hope to match in a straight fight. Greece nearly collapsed before a sword was drawn. The oracle at Delphi, the most respected religious authority in the Greek world, told Athens twice to flee, to run. The gods themselves, it seemed, had given up on Greece. But the Athenians found in the oracle's second message a phrase about a wooden wall that would save Athens, and their leader, the brilliant, mercurial, infuriating Themistocles, convinced them it meant their ships, their fleet. Build ships, he said. Trust in the sea. A congress of Greek states had formed the Hellenic League, a defensive alliance unprecedented in Greek history, because it required old enemies to stand together. Athens and Sparta, who had never fully trusted each other, found themselves co-commanders of the Greek resistance. Sparta would lead the land forces. Athens would provide the majority of the fleet. And together, barely, fractiously, constantly on the verge of dissolution, they would face the storm coming from the east. The plan to stop Xerxes relied on geography. Greece is not flat. It is a landscape of mountains and narrow passes and fingers of land thrusting into the sea, and the Greeks knew that terrain intimately. If they could find a place narrow enough that numbers ceased to matter, a bottleneck where the massive Persian army could only bring a few men to bear at any given moment, they might be able to hold long enough for something. Some miracle. Some intervention. Some breakdown in Persian logistics or morale. They found their bottleneck at Thermopylae. Thermopylae means the hot gates, named for the sulfurous hot springs that bubbled nearby. In 480 BC, it was a coastal pass barely wide enough for a cart to pass through, squeezed between the mountains and the sea. Perfect choke point. Leonidas, king of Sparta, led the Greek force north to hold it, 300 Spartans, along with several thousand allied troops from other Greek cities, perhaps 7,000 in total. It was understood from the beginning that this was not a force capable of stopping Xerxes permanently. It was a force capable of buying time. Time for the fleet to fight. Time for the rest of Greece to prepare. Let us stop here and understand what it meant to be one of those 300 Spartans. The Spartans had been told by their oracle at Delphi that either Sparta would be destroyed by Persia or a Spartan king would die. Leonidas knew this. He was not a young man, he was in his 50s or 60s, past the prime of a soldier's life. He chose his 300 personally, selecting only men who had sons, who had produced heirs who could carry on their families' names. He was not taking warriors to Thermopylae. He was taking men he had chosen to die. For 2 days, the Spartans and their allies held the pass. The Persian army crashed against the Greek phalanx like water against stone. Wave after wave of elite soldiers, including the legendary immortals, thrown forward and thrown back with appalling casualties. Xerxes reportedly watched from a golden throne overlooking the battle and rose to his feet 3 times in horror as his men were slaughtered. 2 of his brothers died at Thermopylae. The Spartans kept their line. They kept their discipline. They held. Then a Greek man, a local shepherd named Ephialtes, whose name would become synonymous in the Greek language with nightmare and betrayal, went to Xerxes and told him about a mountain path, a goat track through the hills unknown to most that emerged behind the Greek position. For reward, for money, for reasons history has not fully illuminated, he showed the Persians the way around. Leonidas learned of the betrayal during the night. He had a choice. He could retreat, pull the entire force back, preserve his men, live to fight another day. Or he could hold and die and give the retreating allied forces time to escape. He chose to hold. He kept the Spartans and perhaps 1,400 others, Thespians and Thebans who stayed either by choice or by compulsion, and sent the rest away. On the 3rd and final day, the Persians attacked from both ends of the pass simultaneously. The Greeks fought in the open now, away from the narrowest point, knowing there was no escape. Leonidas died early in the fighting. There was a fierce struggle over his body, the Greeks driving the Persians back 4 times before the body was finally held by Greek hands. In the end, they retreated to a small hill and made their final stand. The Persians surrounded them and shot them down with arrows. Every one of the Spartans died. Every one of the Thespians who had stayed voluntarily. When it was over, Xerxes was so enraged by what these men had cost him that he ordered Leonidas's head cut off and mounted on a stake. Later, much later, the Greeks would erect a stone inscription over the Spartan dead. It read, in the translation that has echoed through more than 2 millennia, "Go, tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here, obedient to their laws, we lie." 16 words. 16 of the most famous words ever carved in stone. We should pause here. We ask you to pause wherever you are watching this and sit with what those words mean. Because they are not a lament. They are not a cry of despair. They are a declaration, a statement of purpose. These men did not die by accident. They died by choice, obedient to their laws, to the idea that some things are worth dying for. Thermopylae fell. Xerxes marched south. Athens was evacuated. An astonishing logistical and emotional achievement, moving the entire civilian population of one of the ancient world's great cities onto ships, onto the island of Salamis, into the homes of neighbors and strangers, leaving behind only a handful of old men who refused to leave the Acropolis and a garrison of priests. The Persians entered Athens and burned it. The temples on the Acropolis were set ablaze. The city that had invented democracy was ash and cinder under the Persian boot. And yet, the Greek fleet remained undefeated. 378 warships, mostly Athenian, gathered in the narrow strait of water between the island of Salamis and the Athenian coast. Against them, the Persian fleet, still enormous despite losses to storms and previous engagements, prepared to administer the final blow. Destroy the fleet, and Greece would have nothing left. Destroy the fleet, and the war was over. The man who saved Greece was Themistocles. He was, by every account, a man of dazzling intelligence and breathtaking moral flexibility. He had championed the construction of the Athenian fleet years before the invasion began, convincing his fellow citizens to invest a silver windfall in ships rather than distributing it as personal payments. He saw further than almost anyone else. And now, with the Greek alliance fraying, the Spartan general Eurybiades wanted to retreat, wanted to defend the Peloponnese, wanted to abandon Athens and the northern Greek states. Themistocles did something extraordinary. He sent a secret message to Xerxes. The message told the Persian king that the Greeks were divided and demoralized, that they planned to flee during the night, and that if Xerxes wanted to trap and destroy them, he should block the exits from the Strait of Salamis immediately. Some historians believe Themistocles was hedging his bets, creating an escape route if the battle went badly, ingratiating himself with the potential victor. Others believe it was a trap, a deliberate manipulation designed to force Xerxes to attack before he was ready, in terrain favorable to the Greeks. Whatever his intention, it worked. Xerxes, believing the Greeks were about to flee, ordered his fleet to seal the strait overnight. His ships rode through the darkness. His men grew tired, and in the morning, the Persian fleet found itself crowded into a narrow channel, its numerical advantage negated by geography, facing Greek triremes crewed by some of the finest sailors in the world. The Battle of Salamis, fought in late September 480 BC, was arguably the most consequential naval engagement in ancient history. The Greeks, with Themistocles coordinating from a command ship, waited as the Persian fleet entered the Narrows. Then they struck. In close quarters, the heavier Persian ships became liabilities. They crashed into each other, unable to maneuver, unable to bring their numbers to bear. The Greek triremes, faster and better handled, rammed and withdrew like a boxer working inside the reach of a larger opponent. Xerxes watched from a golden throne on a hillside overlooking the strait. He had brought scribes with him to record the names of Persian captains who fought with distinction, and to record the names of those who failed, for punishment afterward. What the scribes recorded instead was catastrophe. Persian ships sinking, capsizing, burning. Persian sailors drowning. Many of them could not swim, soldiers carried on ships but not sailors themselves. Greek ships darting and striking and withdrawing through the carnage. By the end of the day, Persia had lost more than 200 ships. Greece had lost perhaps 40. Xerxes left Greece shortly afterward. Whether he fled in panic, as Greek sources suggest, or executed a planned strategic withdrawal, as modern historians sometimes argue, is a matter of debate. What is not debatable is that he left. He took the bulk of his army back across the Hellespont, leaving behind a force of perhaps 100,000 soldiers under his cousin Mardonius to continue the campaign. But the moral and strategic momentum had shifted irrevocably. Greece had not been conquered. Greece had won the sea. And without the sea, Persia could not supply and reinforce its army indefinitely. The following summer, 479 BC, brought the final act of the great Persian invasion. Mardonius and his army had overwintered in Thessaly, then marched south again, occupying Athens for a second time. But the city was empty. The Athenians had refused his peace offers, refused to collaborate, refused to accept Persian rule even when their city was occupied for the second time in 2 years. The stubbornness of Athens in this period is almost incomprehensible in its scale. They were homeless. They were refugees. Their city had been burned twice, and still they refused to yield. The decisive battle came at Plataea, in the summer of 479 BC, the same Plataea whose soldiers had stood with Athens at Marathon 9 years before. The Greek army that assembled there was the largest the city-states had ever combined, perhaps 40,000 hoplites under the Spartan general Pausanias, backed by tens of thousands of light-armed troops and allies. Mardonius commanded a Persian force of perhaps 80 to 100,000. The Battle of Plataea was messy, confused, and nearly catastrophic for the Greeks before it became a decisive victory. There were supply problems, water shortages, cavalry raids that disrupted Greek movements. There was a night withdrawal that went badly wrong, leaving the Greek forces scattered and confused as dawn broke. Pausanias sent urgent messages to Sparta. "Come now, we are in trouble, come now." For a terrible few hours, it seemed as though the Greek alliance might simply fall apart in the darkness and confusion. Then the Spartan phalanx turned and faced the oncoming Persians. The Persians, brave fighters, splendidly equipped, veterans of campaigns across the ancient world, charged with everything they had. But Persian equipment was not designed for the kind of close-order, shield-to-shield combat that the Spartans practiced. Persian wicker shields and lighter armor were devastating against cavalry and in open terrain. Against a Spartan phalanx, pushed forward and bristling with spears, they were insufficient. Mardonius himself rode to the front and led the fighting personally. When he died, struck down in the press of battle, his white horse killed beneath him, his bodyguard cut apart around him, the Persian resistance collapsed. The rout became a pursuit. Tens of thousands of Persians died, either in the battle itself or in the desperate retreat that followed. The Persian camp, filled with extraordinary wealth, fell into Greek hands. The war in Greece was effectively over. On the same day as Plataea, the same day, according to ancient tradition, though modern historians are skeptical, the Greek fleet destroyed the remnants of the Persian navy at the Battle of Mycale, on the coast of Asia Minor. Both Persian forces were broken on the same day. The symmetry was too perfect not to become legend. But the Greco-Persian Wars did not end in 479 BC. The fighting continued for another 30 years, campaigns in Cyprus, in Egypt, along the Aegean coastline, as Athens led an aggressive alliance called the Delian League in pushing Persian power back from the Greek world. Athens transformed its wartime alliance into something approaching an empire of its own, collecting tribute from allies, garrisoning cities, building monuments to its own greatness with money that had been intended for collective defense. The Peace of Callias, around 449 BC, finally ended the official state of war between Greece and Persia, though the exact terms and even the existence of this treaty are disputed by historians. What is not disputed is that by the middle of the 5th century BC, the Persian threat to the Greek mainland was over. The Persians withdrew behind their own borders. The Greek cities of Ionia, whose revolt had started the whole catastrophe 50 years before, were acknowledged to be in a Greek sphere of influence. The cost had been staggering. Cities burned, populations enslaved, fleets sunk, armies destroyed. The plain of Marathon, the pass at Thermopylae, the Strait of Salamis, the fields of Plataea, these places were soaked in blood so deep that the land itself seemed to remember it for generations afterward. And yet what emerged from this catastrophe was something astonishing. The generation of Greeks who had fought at Marathon and Salamis and Plataea returned home, those who returned with an unshakable, burning sense of their own significance. They had faced the greatest empire on earth and they had not broken. They had faced extinction and they had chosen to fight. And that choice, that extraordinary collective act of defiance, unleashed something in Greek culture that we still live inside of today. The half-century after the Persian Wars is called, simply, the Golden Age of Athens. It was the age of Pericles, who rebuilt the burned temples of the Acropolis and gave Athens the Parthenon, that perfect marble building that still crowns the Acropolis hill and still takes your breath away. It was the age of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, who invented tragedy and in doing so invented the possibility of serious drama as a tool for examining the human condition. It was the age of Socrates, who walked the streets of Athens asking questions that no one had dared ask before, about justice and virtue and what a good life looks like. It was the age of Herodotus himself, the father of history, who invented the very idea of writing history as a systematic, evidence-based inquiry into the past. None of this is coincidence. The Persian Wars created the conditions for the Greek Golden Age, because they created a generation of Greeks who knew, in their bones, in their blood, that they were capable of the extraordinary. A people who have faced the worst and survived it tend to think very expansively about what they might achieve. Athens, after Salamis, was a city in a permanent state of astonished pride. They had saved the world. Now they would build something worthy of that salvation. It is worth pausing on the individual human stories buried within these vast historical movements, because history is never only about armies and kings. It is about people. Take, for instance, Aeschylus, the great playwright who fought at Marathon as a hoplite soldier and whose epitaph, which he reportedly wrote himself, mentioned not his plays but his service at Marathon. A man who gave the world Agamemnon and the Orestia considered his greatest achievement to be standing in the line at Marathon. What does that tell us about how that battle was experienced by the men who fought in it? Or consider the Plataeans, that small city that sent its soldiers to stand with Athens at Marathon when the rest of Greece stood aside. The Plataeans were granted Athenian citizenship in perpetuity for their loyalty, a unique honor. When Plataea was later destroyed in the Peloponnesian Wars, the Athenians considered it a personal grief. Little cities can make big choices. Little choices can echo for centuries. Consider Themistocles himself, the man who perhaps more than any other single individual saved Greece. After the Persian Wars, he was ostracized from Athens, banished. His political enemies, his personal rivals, the voters of his own city voted to expel him. He wandered from city to city, eventually finding himself in the most extraordinary irony in ancient history. A refugee at the court of the Persian king, the enemy he had spent his life defeating. He was given cities to govern. He lived out his days in Persian service. Some accounts say he eventually committed suicide rather than lead a Persian army against his own people. He died in Persia, the man who had saved Greece, an exile from the civilization he had preserved. History is rarely tidy. Greatness is rarely rewarded. But the work persists even when the workers are forgotten. We want to ask you something as we approach the end of this story. What does this war mean to us? Not in terms of modern parallels, not in terms of political lessons we're meant to extract, but simply as a human story. Because when you strip away the historical context, the military terminology, the complex web of cause and effect, what remains is something very simple. A group of people decided that what they had, their way of life, their freedom, their institutions, their culture was worth dying for. And they were right, and their choice echoed outward in time, touching lives they would never know existed, shaping civilizations that had not yet been born. The ideas that Athens incubated in the decades after the Persian Wars, democracy, philosophy, drama, history, rational inquiry, the rule of law, became the foundations on which subsequent civilizations built themselves. The Romans were obsessed with Greece. The Renaissance humanists were obsessed with Greece. Every culture that has ever grappled seriously with questions of freedom and governance and what it means to live well has found itself sooner or later in conversation with those Athenians who rebuilt their city on the ashes of Persian destruction and decided to create something beautiful. If this story has moved you, and we believe it should, because it is one of the great human stories, share it. Tell someone else. Comment below. Which moment of this war gripped you most? Was it Marathon? Thermopylae? Salamis? We read every comment, and we genuinely want to know which part of this story landed hardest for you. The Persian Empire itself did not fall as a result of these wars. It continued for another century and a half, great and powerful and enduring. It was eventually conquered by Alexander the Great, a Macedonian king whose armies carried Greek culture to the edges of the known world, to Egypt and Persia and Afghanistan and India, and perhaps that is the final irony, the final twist of this extraordinary story. Greece could not destroy Persia by fighting it, but Greece conquered Persia by surviving it. By surviving, thriving, and producing a culture so compelling, so dynamic, so alive with ideas, that eventually the world could not resist it. The walls of Persepolis were burning when Alexander stood before them in 330 BC. Some say he ordered the burning deliberately, as revenge for the burning of Athens 150 years before. Whether or not that is literally true, it is mythically true. The world had turned. The fire that burned Athens had been answered, across a century and a half, by another fire entirely. As we close this story, let us return one final time to Thermopylae, to that narrow pass between the mountains and the sea, to a morning in the late summer of 480 BC, when the last of the 300 Spartans stood on a hill with no hope of survival and no intention of flight. They were not naive. They were not ignorant of what was coming. They were professional soldiers of the most formidably trained military culture in the ancient world, and they knew precisely how this morning would end. And they chose to stand, not because they thought a miracle would save them, not because they believed the gods would intervene at the last moment, but because they understood something that is perhaps the most enduring lesson of this entire extraordinary conflict, that the manner in which people face impossible circumstances determines what comes after. That courage is not the absence of fear, it is the decision, despite fear, to hold your ground. That small acts of defiance, performed by ordinary people in desperate situations, can redirect the current of history entirely. Thermopylae did not save Greece. Salamis saved Greece. Plataea saved Greece. But Thermopylae, those 3 days in a mountain pass, those 300 men choosing death over surrender, gave Greece the moral courage to keep fighting when every rational calculation said the war was lost. It gave them a story to tell themselves about who they were and what they were capable of. And stories, the right stories told at the right moment, can be more powerful than armies. We carry these stories forward because they belong to us. Not to ancient Greece specifically, not to the descendants of the Spartans or the Athenians, but to all of us who have ever faced something that seemed too large to overcome and chosen to face it anyway. The Greco-Persian Wars ended nearly 2,500 years ago. The people who fought them turned to dust long centuries past. But the questions they answered with their lives: what is freedom worth? What are we capable of? What do we owe each other and our civilization? Those questions have not aged a day. That is why we tell this story. That is why it matters. That is why, as long as people gather to hear tales of extraordinary human courage and its consequences, the hot gates will not be forgotten. Thank you for watching. If this documentary moved you, if it taught you something, if it made you see the ancient world in a new light, please subscribe and share it with someone who loves history as much as you do. We have more stories to tell. Stories of battles and civilizations and moments when everything changed, and we do not want you to miss a single one. The world's history is waiting. Let's explore it together. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, share, and turn on notification for more documentary stories.